They say everyone's running from something. For me, it was a mountain of debt that had become a suffocating avalanche, and a string of bad decisions that had slammed shut every door I once thought open. So, when the recruiter painted a picture there of a station, a remote oil rig in the North Atlantic, as a place where a man could make a fortune if he wasn't afraid of hard work and solitude, I signed on the dotted line. Roostabout. Bottom of the totem pole, which suited me fine. I wasn't looking for a career. I was looking for an escape hatch, a place where the world couldn't reach me, and where I could, with any luck, outrun my ghosts. The chopper ride out was the first clue that remote was an understatement. Land vanished behind us with alarming speed, replaced by an endless, slate, gray canvas of churning water that seemed to swallow the sky at the horizon. After what felt like an eternity, the Erebus appeared a skeletal, rust, brown insect squatting on the vast, indifferent ocean. It was immense, a city of steel and pipes, yet it looked terrifyingly fragile against the backdrop of all that nothingness. I warred with a primal unease that settled deep in my gut. I tried to chalk it up to nerves, the new guy jitters. But a small, cold voice whispered that this was different. The air, even through the roar of the rotors, carried a strange cocktail of scents. The sharp tang of brine, the acrid bite of rust, the greasy promise of money, and something else of faint, almost imperceptible metallic bitterness that clung to the back of my throat. Stepping onto the deck of the Erebus station was like walking into the belly of some colossal, mechanical beast. However, we soon discovered why. The noise was a physical assault, the relentless, deafening thrum of generators that vibrated through the steel grates underfoot. The percussive clang of metal on metal, the distant, muffled shouts of men, the sudden, violent hiss of hydraulics. It was a symphony of industry, but one played at a volume designed to shatter nerves. The rig itself was a disorienting labyrinth of narrow corridors, steep stairwells, and towering structures, most of it windowless, creating an immediate, suffocating sense of being trapped deep within a machine. The air here was thicker, heavy with the cloying sweetness of diesel, the ever-present salt, and that other smell, stronger now, not just metallic, but with an undercurrent that was faintly organic and deeply, unsettlingly wrong. My orientation was a blur. I met a few faces in the steel jungle. There was Pops, a leathery old derrick hand with eyes that had seen too many sunrises over this godforsaken water. His welcome was a grunt and a curt nod. "Just do your job, kid," he'd rasped, his voice like grinding gears. "Keep your head down, and don't go listening to the pipes. She's always hungry, this old girl." He'd gestured vaguely at the rig around us, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before he turned away. Then there was Sarah, the rig's medic. She was all business, running through the safety protocols with a practiced efficiency, but her eyes, when they met mine, held a deep-seated wariness, a resignation that went beyond the stress of an isolated posting. That first night, the true weight of the isolation crashed down. I found a small, designated smoking area on an exposed catwalk, the wind whipping at my face. Looking out, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just an infinite expanse of black water, mirroring a cold, star-dusted sky. It was a terrifyingly beautiful and humbling sight, hammering home just how utterly alone we were. A tiny, insignificant speck of light and noise in a universe that couldn't care less. Back in my cramped, shared cabin, the sounds of the rig seemed to transform in the darkness. The constant thrumming took on a different quality, less mechanical, more rhythmic, like the slow, deep breathing of something unimaginably vast. Sometimes I'd swear I could hear a low groan, as if the very steel beneath me was sighing under some immense, unseen pressure. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the relentless cycle of 12-hour shifts. The work was brutal, physically demanding, hauling heavy chains, scrubbing down equipment, climbing slick ladders, every muscle screaming in protest. By the end of the day, the monotony was broken only by a bone, deep exhaustion that sleep barely touched. The shared cabin felt smaller each day. The forced joviality in the mess hall during meals grating on my already frayed nerves. It was around the third week that I started noticing the hum. It wasn't the rig's machinery. This was different. A persistent, low frequency thrum that seemed to vibrate up from the ocean floor itself, through the rig's massive legs, into the very marrow of my bones. At first, is almost imperceptible, a background sensation you could easily dismiss. But it grew, or perhaps my sensitivity to it did. It started to give me dull headaches, a constant feeling of pressure behind my eyes, as if the air itself was too thick to breathe. Then came the other things, the fleeting anomalies I tried to rationalize away as products of fatigue and stress, shadows flickering at the very edge of my vision, especially when I was looking out at the dark water or down one of the long, dimly lit service corridors. Sudden, inexplicable cold spots in areas that should have been warm. Pockets of air that felt like they'd been breathed out by something frozen. And the comms, sometimes, during routine radio chatter, I'd catch faint, distorted whispers or a series of rapid clicks buried beneath the normal transmissions, too brief, too indistinct to be certain. Signal interference, I told myself. Old equipment. I was becoming jumpier, my temper shorter. Sleep was a battlefield of vague, unsettling dreams, crushing pressures, immense, unseen shapes moving in the abyssal dark. I noticed the other crew members too. The way their laughter sometimes died too quickly. The way they avoided prolonged eye contact. The forced heartiness that often felt like a thin veneer over something else. Pops, in particular, seemed more withdrawn, his cryptic warnings from my first day echoing in my mind. Were they all hearing the hum, seeing the shadows? Or was I slowly losing my grip, the isolation and the grind finally cracking me open? The first real tremor, the thing that told me this wasn't just in my head, happened during a surprise muster drill. The general emergency alarm blared. 7 short blasts followed by one long one. But it was wrong. Interspersed with the familiar electronic shriek was another sound, a high-pitched, unearthly screech that clawed at my ears, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. We scrambled to our designated muster station, the unease palpable even among the veteran crew. Our station was Lifeboat 4. As the safety officer, a grim-faced man named Henderson began the roll call. His voice faltered. He was staring at the lifeboat. The heavy-duty steel clamps securing the lifeboat to its davits were bent. Not snapped, not rusted through, but bent outwards, as if something immensely powerful had tried to pry the boat loose from the inside. One of the thick, reinforced viewing ports was shattered, webbed with cracks, radiating from a central impact point, also on the interior. "What in God's name?" Henderson muttered, his face pale. I tried to talk to Pops about it later, cornering him in the mess hall. That lifeboat, that wasn't normal, was it? He just stared into his coffee cup, his knuckles white. "Rigs are strange places, kid," he finally said, his voice low and flat. Best not to ask too many questions. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Sarah." When I cautiously brought it up during a routine check, up for a cut on my hand, offered a strained, overly technical explanation about potential pressure differentials and material stress fatigue. It sounded like bullshit, and the look in her eyes told me she knew it too. The official report, posted briefly on the mess hall bulletin board, cited unexpected structural stress due to extreme weather fluctuations. There hadn't been any extreme weather. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I wasn't just tired or stressed. Something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong with the Erebus station. I started to feel like I was under observation, not by the other crew, but by something else, something vast, unseen, and ancient, stirring in the lightless depths below. I became hyper-aware after that, a raw nerve ending. Every creak of the rig, every unusual shadow, every flicker on the comms sent a jolt through me. The hum was definitely louder now, more insistent, a malevolent pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own racing heartbeat. I started taking notes, little things, times, locations, anything that felt off, a desperate, futile attempt to gather proof of, I didn't even know what. Last night it happened. I was on the graveyard shift, assigned to check some sensor readings on a lower catwalk near the moon pool. It's an eerie place at the best of times, a gaping maw in the rig's belly that opens directly to the black ocean hundreds of feet below. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind through the girders and the endless, hungry slosh of water against the rig's legs. And the hum, of course. Always the hum. As I was jotting down a reading, I heard it. A sound distinct from the rig, from the ocean. It came from below, from the moon pool. A series of low, guttural clicks, almost like chattering, but too deep, too resonant for any animal I knew. It stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears. Silence, save for the rig and the sea. Then, a soft, wet thump against the leg of the rig, just beneath me. I leaned over the railing, my heart hammering against my ribs, flashlight beam cutting a shaky path into the darkness. For a horrifying, stomach-dropping instant, I saw it. Just a glimpse. Something immense, pale, and glistening surfaced in the inky water, illuminated briefly by the rig's floodlights, reflecting off the choppy surface. It was impossibly large, dwarfing any whale, any known creature of the deep. Not a solid shape, but a suggestion of one, a colossal, undulating mass that seemed to absorb the light. 2 points of what might have been eyes, blacker than the water, reflected my flashlight beam for a nanosecond. Then, with a sound like a mountain sighing, it submerged, gone as if it were never there, leaving only rolling water and a profound, soul-shaking terror in its wake. I don't know what's going on here. It's not the sea, it's not equipment failure, not in any way we understand it. Something is on this rig, or under it, and it's aware of us. I have to get this out. I don't know how much longer I, or any of us have. Something is terribly wrong. I stumbled back from the railing, a choked gasp tearing from my throat. My flashlight clattered to the steel deck, its beam skittering wildly before settling on my own shaking boots. No, I didn't see that. It was a trick of the light, the waves, the goddamn exhaustion. But the image was burned into my retinas. That impossible, pale vastness. The dead black eyes that had reflected my light for a sliver of a second. The air still felt cold where it had breached, and the metallic, organic stench I'd noticed on my first day aboard the Airbus was suddenly, sickeningly, stronger here, an invisible miasma clinging to the moon pool's edge. I snatched up the flashlight and fled, not daring to look back, my boots thudding a frantic rhythm on the metal gangways. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the rest of my shift hours huddled in my bunk, the rig's every groan and shudder magnified 1,000-fold. Convinced each one was the prelude to it returning, to the entire station being dragged into the abyss. The hum, that damnable, pervasive hum from the deep, seemed to pulse time with the frantic hammering in my chest. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a pressure, a physical weight on my mind. The next shift was agony. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen movement. Every splash against the rig's legs sounded like something trying to gain purchase. I found myself staring obsessively at the dark water, searching for any sign, any ripple that was out of place. My logbook entries became more erratic, filled with frantic scribbles about the moon pool, the size of the thing, the oppressive feeling that was settling over the Erebus like a shroud. I was jumping at my own shadow, and the other crew members were starting to notice. A few sympathetic glances, mostly wary ones. No one wants to be near the guy who's cracking up. I had to talk to Pops. He'd been here the longest. He'd hinted that he knew things. I found him during a meal break, hunched over a plate of something gray and unappetizing in the noisy mess hall. "Pops," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "Last night, at the moon pool, I saw something. Something huge." He didn't look up. Just kept pushing his food around with a fork. Lot of strange things in the deep, kid. No, it wasn't natural. It was massive, pale, it looked at me. Pops finally stopped moving his fork. He slowly raised his head, and his eyes, usually just tired, held a chilling depth. Some doors are best left unopened, son. Some waters best left unstirred. You go poking around in things you don't understand, you're liable to wake up something that was happy sleeping. His voice was low, gravelly. and carried a weight of grim certainty that froze the blood in my veins. But what is it? I pressed, desperate. What's down there? He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. Doesn't matter what it is. What matters is it's there. And it don't like us much. This rig, she's a trespasser. Always has been. He picked up his fork again. Eat your food. And keep your head down. Might live longer. His words offered no comfort. Only a terrifying confirmation of my fears. There was no rational explanation. No shared delusion. It was real. The hum intensified over the next few days. It was a constant companion now, a grinding, sub-audible thrum that vibrated through the rig's steel bones and into ours. Headaches became common. Tempers frayed even more than usual. I saw one roughneck, a big guy named Carter, suddenly double over during his shift, clutching his head and vomiting onto the deck. Sarah, the medic, rushed him to the infirmary, later citing severe migraines, possibly stress-induced. But I saw the look on Carter's face. It was more than a migraine. It was raw, animal terror. Then, the divers. Part of the rig's routine maintenance involve periodic underwater inspections of the support structures and pipelines. A specialized dive team was on board for this. Two of them, a grizzled veteran named Mac and a younger guy, Miller, went down in the bell to inspect a section of the main riser deep beneath the rig. Standard procedure. They were supposed to be down for 4 hours. After 2, their comms crackled. Mac's voice, usually calm and professional, was tight with panic. "Surface! Surface! Get us up! Now!" Then a garbled shout from Miller, cut off by a sound that wasn't human, a deep, resonant thrumming noise, almost like the rig's own hum, but amplified, focused, and filled with a terrifying, predatory intelligence. It was followed by a sickening crunch, and then silence. Dead air. The winch operators worked frantically, hauling the dive bell up. It seemed to take an eternity. When it finally breached the surface and was swung onto the deck, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Henderson, the safety officer, and a couple of others wrenched the hatch open. Miller was gone. Vanished. Mac was inside, alive, but broken. He was curled in a fetal position, eyes wide and unseeing, muttering incoherently about teeth. So many teeth, the dark had opened. He was shivering violently. Despite the warmth of the bell, there was a deep gouge, like dent in the side of the heavy steel bell, as if something immense had bitten into it, or tried to crush it. The reinforced viewport was cracked, spiderwebbing outwards from a central impact point. It looked chillingly similar to the damage on Lifeboat 4. The official story, disseminated quickly by the rig manager, a stern-faced company man named Thorne, was a catastrophic equipment malfunction and a tragic accident. Miller, they said, had become detached from his tether in strong currents and was lost. Mac was suffering from severe nitrogen narcosis and shock. They locked down the comms, citing the ongoing emergency and investigation. No unauthorized calls out. We were cut off. But we all saw the dive bell. We all heard Mac's initial, terrified screams over the open channel before they cut it. And those of us who had been near the winch room had heard that, that other sound. Fear, raw and undisguised, now stalked the corridors of the Erebus. The forced joviality was gone, replaced by hushed whispers and wide, haunted eyes. Men started moving in groups, avoiding isolated areas, especially near the moon pool or the lower decks. The work continued, because it had to, but it was mechanical, joyless. Each man just going through the motions, his senses screaming. That night, the rig itself seemed to scream. The groans and creaks of the structure under the ocean's pressure were no longer just background noise. They sounded like the tortured cries of a dying beast. The hum from below reached a new crescendo, a deafening, mind-numbing throb that made the fillings in my teeth ache. It felt like the entire station was a tuning fork, struck by an invisible, malevolent hand. I was in my bunk, trying to force down some water, when the emergency alarms blared, the 7 short blasts followed by one long one. But like before, it was interspersed with that alien, high-pitched screech that felt like it was tearing at the inside of my skull. "All hands to muster stations! This is not a drill! Repeat, this is not a drill!" Structural integrity compromised on lower levels.
Evacuate.
Evacuate? Thorne's voice, usually so controlled, was strained, cracking with panic over the PA system. I scrambled out, joining the surge of terrified men heading for the lifeboats. The lights flickered, then died, plunging us into a disorienting darkness, broken only by the emergency strobes that cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar faces into grotesque masks. We reached our assigned lifeboat. The same one, Lifeboat 4, with its previously bent clamps and shattered porthole. The damage looked worse now, the cracks in the viewport wider. As we piled in, a new sound joined the cacophony, a rhythmic, heavy thudding from directly beneath us, from the hull of the rig itself. Thud. Tch. It was getting closer, louder. Then, with a sound like tearing canvas, magnified 1,000 times, a section of the steel deck, plating just yards from our lifeboat, buckled upwards, as if punched from below by an unimaginable force. Seawater geysered into the air, and in the brief, horrifying illumination of a lightning flash that split the stormy sky outside, I saw it, part of it. A colossal, glistening, pale tentacle, thicker than a man's torso, studded with what looked like razor, sharp hooks of barbs uncoiled from the breached deck. It whipped through the air, smashing into a nearby crane, sending twisted metal flying. Then it swept towards our lifeboat. A collective scream tore through the already deafening chaos as the pale, barbed tentacle lashed out. It wasn't aiming for us. Not directly. Not yet. It smashed into the davit arm, holding the lifeboat adjacent to ours, Lifeboat 3. With a sound like a cannonball hitting sheet metal, the heavy steel arm, designed to withstand hurricane, force winds, buckled and tore with horrifying ease, sending Lifeboat 3, half, filled with screaming men, plummeting sideways. It didn't even hit the water cleanly. Its bow slammed into one of the rig's massive support legs with a sickening crunch of fiberglass and bone. Then it vanished into the churning, black waves, dragged under as if by an invisible hand. The screams cut off abruptly, swallowed by the storm and the sea. Launch! For God's sake, launch us! Henderson, the safety officer, bellowed from the front of our lifeboat, his face a mask of terror in the flickering emergency lights. Men fumbled with the release mechanism, their hands slick with rain and sweat. The rhythmic, bone-jarring thuds from beneath the rig floor were getting faster, more violent, shaking the very structure we were desperately trying to escape. Another section of the deck plating ripped open nearby, and a second, then a third tentacle, equally monstrous, erupted into view, flailing blindly, destructively. They were like the arms of some colossal, deep sea horror, feeling their way across their captured prey. With a groan of tortured metal, our lifeboat 4, the one, with the already damaged clamps and cracked viewport, began its descent. It wasn't smooth. It jerked and swayed precariously, the damaged davit groaning in protest. I gripped the safety harness so tightly my knuckles were white, convinced the cables would snap, sending us on the same fatal plunge as Lifeboat 3. Below us, the ocean was a maelstrom. Waves like liquid, mountains crashing against the rig's legs. The wind shrieked, carrying with it the stench of brine, diesel, and that awful, organic, metallic odor that now seemed to emanate from the very air we breathed. We hit the water hard. A jarring impact that sent a shockwave through my spine and through several men from their seats, despite their harnesses. However, we soon discovered why. Water immediately began to gush into cracked viewport Henderson was desperately trying to seal with a spare life jacket and duct tape.
Engine!
Get the engine started, he roared over the storm. Someone, a young roostabout I barely knew, was frantically working the ignition. After a few agonizing sputters, the diesel engine coughed to life, its roar a small, defiant sound against the symphony of destruction around us. As we pulled away, or tried to, the full horror of the Erebus station's demise unfolded before us. It wasn't just sinking, it was being pulled apart. The colossal tentacles, now too numerous to count, had wrapped themselves around the rig's superstructure, their pale, glistening lengths constricting like monstrous pythons. Steel screamed and tore. Explosions blossomed along its length as pipes ruptured and fuel ignited. The main derrick, a skeletal finger against the storm, racked sky tilted, groaned, and then collapsed into a shower of sparks and debris. The rig's emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the dying behemoth into near darkness, illuminated only by the raging fires and the hellish, intermittent flashes of lightning. And the sound was indescribable. Not just the roar of the storm and the explosions, but a deep, resonant, guttural tearing, as if the ocean itself was ripping the steel apart. Interspersed with this was a series of high-pitched, chittering screeches that seemed to emanate from the creature or creatures. Below, a sound that vibrated in my teeth and made my stomach churn with primal fear. The pervasive hum we'd all been, felated into a physical force, a crushing pressure wave that pulsed with every destructive act of the entity. Then, the Erebus began to go under. It wasn't a slow descent. The entire structure tilted at an impossible angle, held for a moment against the raging sea, and then, with a final, deafening roar of collapsing metal and hissing steam. It slid beneath the waves. One moment it was there, a burning monument to human folly. The next, only a vortex of churning water, debris, and the flickering remnants of fires, being extinguished by the hungry ocean. And the tentacles. They writhed for a moment at the surface, like the arms of a drowning giant, before slowly, deliberately, retracting into the depths, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural calm in the water where the rig had stood. We were alone, adrift in a tiny, damaged lifeboat, on a furious ocean, with that thing somewhere beneath us. There were maybe 20 of us crammed into Lifeboat 4, designed to hold more. But many hadn't made it. Pops was there, his face grim, his eyes scanning the waves. Sarah, the medic, was already tending to a man whose arm had been broken during the chaotic launch. Henderson was trying to get the radio to work, but it was useless, only emitting static and the occasional, terrifyingly clear click or whisper that sounded chillingly, like the interference I'd heard on the rig's comms. The storm raged on for what felt like an eternity. Our lifeboat was tossed about like a toy, waves crashing over the bow, soaking us to the bone with freezing spray. The makeshift patch on the viewport was barely holding, and a constant stream of icy water trickled in, pooling at our feet. Every creak of the fiberglass hull, every unusually large wave, sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. Was it the storm, or was it the creature, toying with us, nudging us from below? As the first, gray, miserable light of dawn began to break, the storm started to abate, leaving behind a hiving, slate, gray sea and a sky the color of ash. We were exhausted, freezing, and terrified. Sarah did her best to treat the injured, but supplies were limited. The man with the broken arm was moaning softly. Another had a nasty gash on his forehead, his face pale and clammy. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a creeping, gnawing dread. It was Pops who spotted it first. He pointed a shaking finger towards the horizon. "What in the blazes is that?" At first, I couldn't see anything but the endless expanse of waves. Then, I saw it. A patch of water, perhaps a mile or two distant. That was different. It was unnaturally calm, almost glassy, despite the surrounding swell. And it was a strange, milky, opalescent color. As we watched, the patch seemed to be growing, spreading outwards like an oil slick. But this was no oil. "Steer away from it!" Henderson yelled at the roostabout at the tiller. But the current, or something else, seemed to be gently, inexorably, pulling us towards it. The hum started to return, not the violent pulse from the rig's destruction, but the insidious, low-frequency thrum that had plagued us for weeks. It seemed to be emanating from the direction of that milky patch of water. As we got closer, maybe half a mile out, we began to see shapes moving within the opalescent water. Not distinct. Not like fish or whales. These were vast, shadowy forms, gliding just beneath the surface, their movements slow, deliberate, and utterly alien. There were dozens of them, some smaller, some impossibly large, all converging towards the center of the milky patch. Then, from the very heart of that strange, calm sea, something began to rise. It wasn't a tentacle this time. It was a structure, if you could call it that. A glistening, black, chitinous spire, impossibly tall and slender, like some grotesque parody of a cathedral steeple, emerging silently from the depths. It was covered in intricate, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. More spires began to rise around it, forming a bizarre, organic cityscape in the middle of the desolate ocean. No one spoke. We just stared, mouths agape, a new, colder, more profound terror gripping us. This wasn't just a monster. This was something else. Something ancient, something intelligent, something that was building. One of the men at the back of the lifeboat started to whimper, a low, animal sound of pure, unadulterated fear. Sarah tried to calm him, but her own face was ashen. The hum intensified, and now, mixed with it, was a new sound. A faint, melodic, almost flute-like call, echoing across the water from the rising structures. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, unearthly way, and it felt like it was calling to something. Or perhaps calling to us. The current, or whatever force was at play, was still pulling our little lifeboat closer. The engine, which had been sputtering, chose that moment to die completely, with a final, choked gasp. We were adrift, powerless, being drawn towards the impossible. Alien city rising from the waves, towards the source of that haunting, beckoning call. The milky water, with its shadowy inhabitants, was now only a few hundred yards away. I could see details on the nearest spire. It wasn't smooth, but composed of countless, smaller, interlocking segments, some of which seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. And I realized, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that the Erebus station hadn't just been destroyed. It had been harvested, and we were next. The silence in the lifeboat was a fragile thing, stretched taut over a pit of unspoken terror. Every man stared, transfixed, as our crippled vessel drifted, inexorably, towards the impossible city of black spires. The milky, opalescent water, now only 100 yards off, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, and the shadowy forms within it, vast and indistinct, moved with a slow, ponderous grace that was utterly chilling. They weren't swimming like any creature I knew. They seemed to flow through the water, their outlines blurring and reforming. The air grew colder, and the faint, metallic, organic scent we'd first encountered on the Erebus, and which had intensified with each new horror, was now thick, cloying, almost suffocating. It was the smell of the deep, ancient ocean, but also something else, something alien and unwholesome. The flute-like call, emanating from the forest of shifting, chitinous spires, grew in intensity. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a vibration that resonated deep within my chest, in my bones, in the very fillings of my teeth. It was beautiful, yes, in a way that a perfectly formed venomous flower might be, beautiful, intricate, alluring, and utterly deadly. But beneath the melody, there was an undercurrent, a complex tapestry of clicks, whistles, and low rumbles that spoke of an intelligence far removed from human comprehension. It wasn't a call to us in the way a rescuer might call. It felt more like a summons. Or perhaps the sound of a shepherd calling his flock. "Try the radio again?" Henderson hissed, his voice cracking. The young roustabout, who had tried to start the engine earlier, now fumbled with the radio, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the microphone. Static. Only static, and then, for a horrifying moment, a burst of those same rapid, guttural clicks I'd heard from the moon pool, clearer now, sharper, as if the speaker was right beside us. He dropped the microphone as if it had burned him. We were at the edge of the milky water. The transition was stark. One moment, the dark, heaving gray of the open Atlantic. The next, this unnaturally calm, glowing, opalescent soup. As our bow drifted into it, the water felt thicker, almost viscous. And the hum, that deep, pervasive hum that had been the soundtrack to our descent into madness, intensified, locking onto the frequency of the alien city's call, creating a disorienting, nauseating thrum that seemed to bypass the ears and drill directly into the brain. Men started to react. One, a roughneck named Griggs, who'd been unnervingly silent since the Erebus went down, began to laugh, a high-pitched, giggling sound that was more terrifying than any scream. Sarah tried to soothe him, but he pushed her away, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on the nearest spire. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "They're calling us home." Then, before anyone could react, he clambered onto the gunwale and threw himself into the milky water. He didn't struggle. He just sank, a beatific smile on his face, disappearing into the glowing depths as if embraced. One of the shadowy forms below seemed to shift, to swell, and then he was gone. Panic erupted. Two more men tried to follow Griggs' example, their faces rapturous, muttering about the song and the light. Pops and a couple of others wrestled them back, but it was a desperate struggle. The call was insidious, it bypassed reason, tugging at some primal, buried part of the mind. I felt it myself, a strange, seductive pull, a longing to surrender, to become part of that vast, alien consciousness. It took every ounce of my willpower to fight it, to cling to the terror and the anger as anchors against that siren song. Our lifeboat was now fully within the perimeter of the alien city. The spires towered over us, hundreds of feet tall, their black, chitinous surfaces glistening wetly, covered in those shifting, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. They weren't solid, I could see openings, like immense, dark maws. And occasionally, a section of a spire would ripple, or a new segment would extrude itself with a soft, wet, sucking sound. The entire city felt organic, alive, a colossal, deep-sea coral reef built by nightmares. And the things in the water, we could see them more clearly now. They weren't fish, not squid, not anything that belonged in any biology textbook. They were amorphous, translucent beings, shot through with veins of pale light, their forms constantly shifting, extruding pseudopods, cilia, and other unnameable appendages. Some were small, the size of a man. Others were as large as our lifeboat. And in the deeper, glowing haze below, I caught glimpses of truly colossal shapes, their passage stirring the viscous water. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, some tending to the bases of the spires, others simply observing us. "We'll have to get out of here!" Henderson screamed, his face contorted with a mixture of terror and a desperate, futile defiance. "Paddles! Use the goddamn paddles." We had emergency oars stowed beneath the seats. With fumbling, uncoordinated movements, those of us still capable of rational thought tried to deploy them, to turn the lifeboat, to fight against the invisible current that was drawing us deeper into the heart of this abyssal metropolis. But it was like trying to paddle through thick syrup. The water clung to the oars, heavy and resistant, and the creatures in the water reacted. Several of the smaller, man-sized entities detached themselves from the base of a nearby spire and flowed towards us with unnerving speed. They didn't have eyes, not in the conventional sense, but I felt their attention, a cold, analytical pressure. One of them reached the side of the lifeboat, and a pseudopod, glistening and translucent, extended, touching the fiberglass hull. Where it touched, the material seemed to soften, to dissolve like sugar in water. A faint, acidic smell filled the air. A man screamed as one of the creatures flowed up and over the gunwale, its form shifting to pour into the boat. It moved with a horrifying, boundless grace. There was no malice in its advance, no anger, just a calm, inexorable purpose. It flowed over the legs of the nearest man, who shrieked once, a high, thin sound that was cut off abruptly as the creature enveloped him. His form was visible for a moment through its translucent body, thrashing, then stilling, then dimming, as if his life force was being siphoned away. The creature pulsed with a brighter light for a moment, then flowed back over the side, leaving only a damp patch on the floor of the boat. That was when the last vestiges of order collapsed. It was no longer about survival. It was about the desperate, primal instinct to not be touched by those things. Men scrambled over each other, trying to get away from the sides of the boat, their cries lost in the overwhelming thrum and the alien, melodic call that now felt like a funeral dirge. Pops was next to me, his face a stony mask, but his eyes held a deep, soul-weary despair. He'd stopped trying to fight. He just watched, as if accepting a fate he'd long seen coming. She was always hungry, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the din, echoing his first words to me on the Erebus. The ocean, she always takes her due. Another creature, larger this time, rose from the milky depths beside us. It didn't flow into the boat. Instead, a section of its amorphous body solidified, forming a long, slender tendril, tipped with a needle, sharp barb. It moved with lightning speed, striking Sarah in the shoulder. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and then her eyes glazed over. A faint blue light traveled up the tendril from her body into the creature. She slumped, not dead, but empty. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was the end. There would be no rescue, no escape. We were simply being processed. The Erebus had been the appetizer. We were the main course. Or perhaps just insignificant microbes being absorbed by a vast, unthinking organism. The lifeboat was being drawn towards the largest, central spire, a truly colossal structure that seemed to pierce the dark, oppressive sky above. At its base was a vast, circular opening, glowing with an intense, pulsating light, like the maw of some abyssal god. The melodic call was loudest here, and the hum vibrated through my very soul, shaking loose the last of my resistance. A strange sense of peace, of inevitability, began to settle over me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overlaid with a profound, weary resignation. I don't know why I'm writing this. My pen is shaking. The waterproof notebook is slick with spray and other things. Maybe it's a final act of defiance. Maybe it's a warning, though to who, I cannot say. Who would ever find this, in this lost corner of a forgotten hell? The others are gone now, or going. Some absorbed, some willingly leaping into the embrace of the glowing water. Pops just closed his eyes and slid quietly overboard a few minutes ago. Henderson was the last to fight, cursing and swinging a useless oar, until one of the larger forms simply enveloped the stern of the boat, pulling him under with it. Our lifeboat is entering the maw now. The light is blinding. The call is all-consuming. I can feel them. Their thoughts, if you can call them that. Ancient, vast, patient. They are the true inheritors of this world, and we were just a fleeting, noisy infestation on its surface. The pen is slipping. My hand is so cold. If this is found, tell them. Tell them the ocean is not empty. It is waiting. It is hungry, and it is waking up. The hum, it's inside me now. So beautiful.